This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome, folks. Dr. Charles Parker here one more time at Core Brain Journal, and we have a nationally prominent guest here who's going to give us a message about what we can do for our mind health, our body health, and how all these systems actually work together effectively. He's opinionated. He's a strong player with significant authorship, 10 books, and he's got 2 fresh ones coming out of the box we're going to be talking about in just a moment. This is Dr. Joel Fuhrman. Welcome, Joel. Thank you for coming on board.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So in a moment, I'm going to introduce Joel, just a couple of quick words from our sponsors and get that information right online. And then we'll go ahead and introduce Joel and go on with it. So you folks already know how much we love the reality of data here at Core Brain Journal. And today we're welcoming our clinical friend and new sponsor partner, Direct Health Access Laboratory. With over 3 million studies, they're deep leaders of experience with the big picture of measuring, for example, methylation, cryptopyrrole, and copper challenges. They have a global service with a molecular focus. So stay tuned, hear more about them in a minute. And then we have an additional sponsor we're very pleased to talk about, and it's a sponsor partner with a deep interest in fresh options to address the complexity of adolescent treatment failure nationally and internationally. For 80 years, the nonprofit Barry Robinson Center teams in Norfolk, Virginia, provide residential care on an evolved family, interpersonal, and global a global level. And really, quite importantly, they are built TRICARE friendly, and those of you who are in TRICARE know exactly what that means. So without further ado, let me go ahead and talk about Dr. Fuhrman. He is a board-certified family physician, 6 times New York Times best-selling author, and is an internationally recognized expert on nutrition and natural healing, who specializes in preventing and reversing disease through specific nutritional methods. Dr. Fuhrman coined the term nutritarian, first time I heard it, nutritarian, to describe his eating style, which is built around a diet of nutrient-dense, plant-rich foods. For over 25 years, Dr. Fuhrman has shown that it's possible to achieve sustainable weight loss and reverse heart disease, diabetes, and many other illnesses using smart nutrition. In his medical practice and through his books and television specials, he continues to bring this life-saving message to hundreds of thousands of people around the world. It's a real privilege to have you on, Dr. Fuhrman. Thanks for being here. So without further ado, tell us a little bit about what's going on with you now. You have a number of projects. We were talking a little bit offline before we got started. You have a number of projects that are going on. We're really going to chase some of them down later on. But let's talk about your mission and where you are in that mission currently.
Well, I do. I have numerous projects, and some of my projects are in nutritional research. As president of the Nutritional Research Foundation, I have a double-blinded controlled trial on reversal of diabetes with a Harvard affiliate hospital in Boston that's commencing shortly. I've enrolled thousands of people on a breast cancer prevention study that's being run at Northern Arizona University. We have a nutritarian research office there. The whole point is that nutritional science has made incredible advances in the last 10 years, and we can tell people with a lot of scientific integrity that they don't have to have heart disease, they don't have to have strokes, they don't have to get demented as they age. And we can probably wipe out 90% of common cancers if people adopted these modern what I call a nutritarian diet, which is essentially putting together a diet style with a portfolio of foods that have been shown to have powerful anti-cancer effects, which we can talk about. That each one of these foods, like green vegetables and onions and mushrooms, by themselves can reduce risk of cancer significant amounts. But you put a diet style together that includes all these factors, it may have profound effects, and that's what we're studying today. My books, The End of Heart Disease, The End of Diabetes, The End of Dieting, the Eat to Live Cookbook, my books are made so put control back in people's lives so they can control their health destiny. If they have high blood pressure or high cholesterol, they can get rid of that through proper eating and not require the use of medications the rest of their life. And they can protect themselves 100 times more effectively against future heart disease than just taking drugs. And some of these drugs increase risk of cancer, which is never discussed. So I'm saying is that I spend my life with a very comprehensive interest and reading every study on nutritional science and reviewing them, thousands of them, tens of thousands of these studies, to put together a program so people can use modern nutritional science to maximize their life. And I try to do so in a very unbiased and comprehensive fashion so they can give people all the data from the scientific literature, so those that are interested in control and having best health possible cannot have the information watered down or in some way, adapted for personal agendas or to promote a certain way of, promote a certain philosophy. So it's not philosophical based. It's scientific and informational based. So I have to, in some way, disagree with your introduction of me and use the use that I'm opinionated. And the word opinionated means heavily biased and coming to and having a personal agenda that's not trustworthy. Mm-hmm. So I really object to that and think that I strive to produce research and books that are the opposite of that. So giving people comprehensive information, looking at both sides so they can make the right decisions to protect their precious health.
We hit a very commonplace point on that comprehensive word. Okay, so I'm sorry I offended you on the opinionated. I always thought that was a good thing, but I understand what you're talking about, and we don't want you to be biased. We love the scientific way you're thinking about this. This is what we're doing at Core Brain Journal. We totally agree with you, and so it's going to be very interesting to have this conversation. I think even the concept of nutritarian, it's like, we're not going to just do vegetarian. We're going to do something that's going to actually focus on the quality and the specific objectives of what we're eating, as opposed to just doing something in general that sounds healthy.
Exactly. And the point is that there are diets flooding the market of all description. But a nutritarian diet, we don't want people to jump onto fads. We want to look at the overwhelming preponderance of evidence. And we want to give extra credence to studies that have thousands of people enrolled in them. Not a few, not 20 or 30, but thousands. And studies that go on for many years, and studies that look at hard endpoints, not soft endpoints. And the hardest endpoints are death or cancer diagnosis or heart attacks. In other words, when we look at these long studies done for many, many years, we always find the three basic three basic ideas that always come out and are proven over and over again. And that is that the processed foods Americans are eating, especially these low nutrient carbohydrate like white flour and white bread and honey, these high sweet carbohydrates age us prematurely, flood the body with toxic compounds, and are completely deficient in micronutrients, phytochemicals, and antioxidants. Likewise, the same thing we see is that the fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts and seeds, mushrooms and onions, that these natural plant foods don't just have, what I'm saying here is a strawberry doesn't just have 30 vitamins and minerals, it's got more than 700 nutrients in it. Mm-hmm. A piece of broccoli has more than 1,000 different nutrients in it. And they're not optional. A broad spectrum of phytochemicals are needed to protect our health and protect against cancer. And our muscle tissues and some of our cells have an antioxidant response element that is fueled by certain phytochemicals in green vegetables that enable these cells to keep themselves clean and prevent excessive free radical formation. But the brain is different. The brain doesn't have a high degree of antioxidant activity. It needs a continual supply of colorful antioxidants to prevent premature aging and to keep its cells fully functioning and free radicals in control. The point I'm making here is that it's not one diet that protects the heart and another diet that protects the osteoarthritis development and shrinkage of the discs in your spine, and another good diet that's better for the aging of your joints, and another diet that's better to prevent autoimmune disease, and another diet that's better to prevent cancer. It's the same diet style that's rich in phytochemicals and antioxidants, low in animal products, eliminating the oil, the salt, the sugar, the processed foods that people are eating, and rich in these high nutrient plant foods. The same dietary model that we're talking about here slows the aging process and enables people to reverse many serious illnesses. And so it's not one diet for one disease, one diet for a different disease. All these diseases have the same basic causation, whether it's brain or whether it's the body, as you mentioned earlier.
Totally interesting concept, because one of the things that's happened to me in my own medical education was to be fascinated by all these subsets. I have to tell you, it's very interesting and refreshing to think you don't have to think so much. We see so many people who I just can't do it because it's just too complex. And what you're saying, if we get really down to the basics, that we can have a very clear idea of what we're doing that isn't that complicated and actually has application in a number of other comorbid conditions as well as whatever we're attempting to correct.
That's right. And I'm saying something a hair more radical here as well. I'm saying that when you have high blood pressure or diabetes or high cholesterol or heart disease, that these are reversible conditions that are reversible with nutritional excellence. We can get your weight back to normal. We can get your blood pressure back to normal. We can get you have a favorable cholesterol, and you could become non-diabetic. That means your hemoglobin A1C could be in the normal range, your body weight could be normal, and you don't need medication to get it there. Now, what I'm saying here is that nutritional excellence is more powerful than drugs. And when you bring your car to the mechanic at the gas station with the oil light flashing on the dashboard, he doesn't reach in there and snip the wire so you can't see the oil light flash. He recognizes you have to put oil in the car. The point is, when you develop diabetes, taking the drug to lower the blood glucose so it looks okay doesn't take away the insulin resistance and doesn't take away the problems that you're eating yourself into. And the same thing with the stiffening and the development of atherosclerosis, the loss of the vascular elasticity and inflammation of the endothelium. The heart disease, and including the shrinkage of the brain with that causes from atherosclerosis and lack of oxygen to the brain tissue, occurs from what we're eating. And you can't reverse these illnesses with drugs effectively. You can only do so with what people eat. And I'm saying that when you do normalize your blood pressure and your blood glucose and your triglycerides and your blood pressure with food and not medication, then you've protected yourself against an event like a cardiac event or a stroke more than 100 times more effectively than you could have protected yourself by taking medications. And the reliance on medication is tragic and is not allowing our population to really to use modern science to protect themselves adequately. Because they think that doctors have the answer, drugs are their solution, doctors are their saviors, and they're going to be adequately protected by taking a few pills. And that gives them the, how should I say, the unconscious permission that they can eat what they want because they think now that their cholesterol looks okay or their blood pressure looks okay with medication. And the inevitable consequence is their disease advances, their blood vessels age faster, and their body is moving towards a more dangerous outcome because they think they're protected now and they haven't changed their diet adequately.
We're such a difficult time right now because it's really a renovation in applied science. I call it a Galileo mind moment. We have technology and we can see the universe in a different way, and we still think the sun is rotating around Rome. I mean, it looks that way, so we're going to be passive and not deal with it. And one of the biggest problems we have, and we have it psychiatrically over in mind science, and what you're saying is quite emphatically correct. We know it in medical science in terms of people having these kinds of metabolic problems, is the passivity is ingrained in the system. And this is a little philosophic point, as maybe not quite so explicitly scientific, but the change in society in terms of accepting the science then means a more aggressive participatory medicine with individuals who are suffering with these. And if they become more participatory and they get good information from a gentleman such as yourself, and they can actually then have a legitimate plan, then they can participate in their own health and actually do something about it instead of being in that passive vertical management system, which really takes them in places which are oftentimes counterproductive.
Right, exactly.
So let me ask you this question. I'm sorry, you go ahead. Well, I had a question because I'm getting excited about what you're talking about. I started thinking about this because the thing I've seen in on the psychiatric side is you have acute and you have chronic. And what I see happening, a lot of people don't think psychiatry makes any sense at all because it's kind of a fashion show over here. People have labels and they're throwing meds at labels, and nobody's really dealing with the underlying neuroscience, which is one of the reasons I would like to have a gentleman like you on, because I think it's really important to connect the entire situation. And what happens is, in psychiatry, it's so much a chronic condition. And because many of the problems have lasted for many years, individuals have a built-in passivity. So one of the questions that was occurring while you were talking, which, as I said a moment ago, I was getting excited about, is this whole concept of some very severe illnesses that have both an acute, right now, presentation and a chronic presentation. And really, just let's take diabetes for a moment, because I don't know a lot about diabetes, and I think a lot of us don't. I know many of us don't know what you know, but let me ask you this question. When you have a relatively acute onset of type 1 diabetes, where you have an adolescent young child with diabetes, how, in terms of the way you think about it professionally from your point of view with a nutritarian point of view, what's the difference between that and a chronic diabetes or a type 2 diabetes, where the individual has built these things up over time, which I think would probably be, from my limited knowledge, a more reasonable application of what you're doing? Does what you're talking about work for the more acute process?
Well, thanks for that question. Yes, because when you're diabetic and you have higher circulating glucoses, you age faster. You're more likely to die of the younger age of a heart attack or a stroke, right? And get demented and have a higher risk of cancer. And diabetes is the #1 cause of blindness and kidney failure and leg amputations. So it's exceedingly dangerous, and it's ever the more so tragic because all this tremendous morbidity and premature mortality did not have to happen. And so I'm going to clarify. Let me explain this, okay?
Please.
#1, with a type 2 diabetic, it's usually because they're overweight and they're eating improperly, and the beta cells in the pancreas are producing huge amounts of insulin, trying to keep up with the body's needs for insulin, which could be 10 times as high as a person of normal weight who's eating properly. We only need 1/10 the amount of insulin. And after a while, the beta cells poop out, but they're pooping out, but they're still producing more insulin than you would need if you were a normal weight eating a healthy diet.
Gotcha.
I published a study in a medical journal where 90% of people enrolled in the people who were investigated in the study were able to become non-diabetic. Their average hemoglobin A1C went from 8.2 to 5.8, which is the normal range, and most of them were able to come off their medications within 6 months. So we're talking about becoming non-diabetic, and the only way you can truly protect a type 2 diabetic against these serious issues is to have them become non-diabetic and not medicate them for the rest of their life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now let's go to a type 1 for a minute, because a type 1 diabetic has beta cell destruction when they're young. Mm-hmm. And they're treated by endocrinologists and diabetologists and internists and family doctors. But they're treated and they're told to give enough insulin to keep their glucose within a reasonable range. And they're winding up using 2 to 3 times as much insulin as they would have required had they been eaten a more careful diet. And they're given the idea that diet doesn't matter because you can just take more insulin. But they don't recognize
Joe,
become more insulin resistant like a type 2. But insulin itself ages us prematurely.
Joel, pop back for just a second, because I'm on a hard wire. You may not be on a hard wire, but I'm losing you a little bit. You were saying something so emphatic and so useful about type 1 diabetes. And right when you started talking about the fact that people are not paying attention to the diet, but they're relying on the insulin, please repeat that, because you were fading in and out right there.
Oh, yeah, sorry, there was something wrong with the connection. Yes, what I'm saying is that even though it's possible to get well with type 2 diabetics, and even though the type 1 are still going to require some insulin the rest of their life, if eating properly for the type 1 is even more important or just as important for the type 2. This is not just for the type 2, because this is life-saving for a type 1. And I'm saying here that with the right diet, a type 1 diabetic would use less than half as much insulin, maybe even 1/3 as much as a person eating improperly. But, however, they can have a normal life expectancy. They can live to be 90 years old without the morbidity of other type 1s. They don't have to have heart disease and dementia and strokes. In other words, what I'm saying to you, it's so important a type 1 eat a nutritarian-style diet to reduce their need for insulin, because the excess amount of insulin the American style of eating requires ages their body, because excess insulin is damaging for a type 1. We have to get the type 1 using a more reasonable, a much smaller amount of insulin. And when you do so with a proper diet, they don't have the highs and the lows. Their levels are stable. They don't need to snack between meals to keep their sugars up. They're not flying all over the place. It's these extremes from high to low that also puts a strain, it ages the body and puts a lot of stress on the body. So even though this program is not curative for a type 1, it's still just as important for a type 1 to embrace this for their long-term health.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Now, let me ask you how this works, because one of the things we've been focusing on here a great deal is the immunity issue and its relationship with the etiology of these challenging conditions that have to do with sustained good nutrition. So you can eat the right things, but if they aren't absorbed properly, what's your thought about immunity as it fits into this? It's a little bit of a side topic from eating properly, but I just wondered if you had a quick thought about measuring IgG and that sort of thing.
Well, I don't see immunity as being separate. I see it as all part and parcel of the whole of what we're talking about, because these phytochemicals fuel immune function, and whether it's retaining the length of telomeres, whether it's white blood cell activity, and whether it's immune responsiveness and immune surveillance of cancer cells, all these things are intertwined with your diet. And we could say that the same foods like white flour and sugar that help create diabetes also suppress immunity and increase the risk of having infection. And what I want people to do is I want them to have a diet with a high micronutrient density. In other words, I want their diet to be rich in phytochemicals and antioxidants, and I also want their diet to be very comprehensive, in that not missing any particular micronutrient that humans need. So just eating enough kale and strawberries is not sufficient. We also have to not be deficient in vitamin D, in zinc, in iodine, in B12. In other words, we have to make sure that every peg is filled appropriately. And then you have super immunity when that's the case. And I wrote a book. The book was entitled Super Immunity. And the book is focused on how to recover from autoimmune conditions, how to not get infections, and how to prevent cancer. So yes, it's very, very important to eat these foods for your immune system. And I'm saying here that breast cancer and colon cancer and prostate cancer hardly occurred in human history. These are recent.
Right there, when you said recent, when
people
lost
were eating
you.
more natural foods, there was very little cancer ever even mentioned in the science literature, in this literature of those days. The point that I'm making now is that when we eat a diet that uses phytochemicals to build our immune function, then our body can effectively prevent cells from developing cancer, and we can remove abnormal cells, we can repair broken DNA crosslinks, we can prevent epigenetic and methylation changes to the DNA that eventually accumulate and lead to cancer. So all these diseases are interrelated. And I'm also saying here that the same foods that destroy your immunity, like we're talking about eating foods that are rich in calories, that flood the bloodstream with caloric density without nutrients. And we're talking about sugar, and we're talking about white flour, and we're talking about oils, especially heated oils, which have rancidity and are carcinogenic. Cooking fried foods and heated oils, very dangerous. And we're talking about excess amount of animal protein. Diets very high in animal protein, which drive up IGF-1, that cause cellular replication and can.
So we lost you right there again. Animal protein. We lost you. We lost you right after animal protein again. So, Joel, if you could just repeat that last thing you did.
Shoot.
I got the IGF, animal protein. That was, you said just a couple sentences there that were really important, and I'm sorry to ask you to repeat them, but you went out.
Yeah, sorry about this connection. Yeah, the IGF-1 is called insulin-like growth factor 1. Mm-hmm. It's shaped like the insulin molecule. It binds to the insulin receptor. And like insulin, it promotes growth and fat storage, but it also promotes cellular replication, which can promote cancers, and it promotes angiogenesis, which means the growth of blood vessels that can fuel the growth of fat, but also fuel the growth of cancer. So high levels of IGF-1 is driven by excessive consumption of animal protein. It's also raised by sugar, but it's raised by animal protein more, just like insulin is also raised by animal protein, but raised by sugar more. What we're saying here that this high glycemic animal protein sandwich, like a hamburger, macaroni and cheese, a pizza, this American style of eating where you mix a high glycemic carbohydrate with an animal product, particularly drives the aging process and puts us at risk of these serious illnesses. So we have to reduce the exposure to high glycemic carbohydrates and reduce the exposure to animal protein. And that happens by eating more vegetation, more fat from nuts and seeds, more mushrooms, onions, berries, and seeds, more green vegetables, more root vegetables. So we're talking here about a diet that's higher in natural plants and lower in processed foods and lower in animal products too. So that's how you get maximum immune function and maximum flooding of the brain with phytochemicals to protect us from aging of the brain.
Thank you so much. Now, let me ask you this question, because I'm sure this is occurring to some of our listeners, because everyone here that's listening to this is here for a reason. They're like, this is going to be important for my longevity. I mean, how can I actually take some proactive measures to prevent myself from going further down the tubes than I already am, or prevent from actually any kind of problem happening in the first place? The real question then is, you've mentioned a couple of times animal protein. And could you differentiate for us a little bit about animal protein from the following point of view? We're talking, obviously, obvious to me from what I've heard, that may not be correct, so I'll look forward to your correcting me if so. Like beef and that sort of thing would then be one type of animal protein, but fish, flounder, tuna, for example, those other animals are animal protein, but they're not the same kind of protein. What's your take on the different kinds of animal protein? Certainly cut down the volume, but then the next level is the type.
All right. Well, I use the word animal protein in place of using the word animal product for a few different reasons, because animal products generally about 30% fat. And we're finding, for example, that skim milk causes acne more than whole milk does, or skim milk promotes prostate cancer more than whole milk does, because when you remove the fat, you concentrate the protein even more. And it's protein. And when people said, well, the saturated fat in meat is bad and fish doesn't have that saturated fat, it has more omega-3 fat. Yes, but if we look at the protein content in fish is very high, and too much animal protein, even egg whites, people are taking away the yolks to reduce the cholesterol and the saturated fat, but they're eating the whites, which are high in animal protein. I want to be very specific here and saying it's the concentration of this animal protein, because the animal proteins are very complete, biologically complete, and they drive growth. So we're talking about, yes, there are meat. Red meat might be worse than fish, because in addition to being high in animal protein, it also has heme iron, which drives inflammation. The fat is more saturated. It also has more, it also produces more bad bacteria in the gut that promotes some unfavorable effects over fish. So the omega-3 fatty acid balance compared to lizards and snakes and fish and frogs and worms are better when people eat smaller animal products, wild animal products, and seafood, because you have a better omega-3 fatty acid exposure and less saturated fat and omega-6 fatty acids. So that's an advantage of eating fish or eating small wild animals over these large commercially raised animals. So there's an advantage there. However, even with the consumption of more natural and smaller and animal and seafood, there's still the effect of excess animal protein on promoting aging and accelerating death from these common diseases. So as we limit our exposure to animal product, then there are certain animal products that are more acceptable than others. And some of them should be even more restricted than others, as you're saying right now.
Very, very interesting. I didn't know that about skim milk, prostate cancer. I mean, I didn't really think about that balance with the fats and the straight protein. I think it's a very, very interesting point. And
right, because people are saying, fat is not the bad guy anymore. It is the bad guy. Saturated fat is the bad guy, and a bad ratio of omega-6 and saturated fat in relationship to omega-3 does create inflammation, does help shrink the brain, and can be negative to us. However, if you take the fat out of the animal product and just eat the protein component, like the egg white, it's even worse. Because concentrating that protein puts too much effect on too much hormones, growth hormones raised in our tissues too much. And you know what I'm saying? When you eat white rice and white bread and sugar, the carbohydrates flood into your body so rapidly in minutes. Your glucose goes up within minutes. That's the glycemic load. It has to do with how fast these calories enter the bloodstream.
Right.
When we take plant protein, and certain plants are very high in protein, beans have as much protein per calorie as meat. Green vegetables have as much protein per calorie as meat. So beans and seeds and green vegetables are very high in protein. But because their protein is not biologically complete, means that it enters the bloodstream more slowly before it can be utilized, because the body has to mix it with other foods, and it has to mix it with the bacteria buildup in the digestive tract. In other words, we digest the bacteria that live within us, and those supply amino acids slowly to complement the amino acids that are not biologically complete. But because the beans have low glycemic carbohydrate and more slowly absorbable proteins, they don't raise hormones like insulin and IGF-1 to unfavorable levels like a bacon and cheeseburger would. You follow me? So there's different biological effects on getting more protein from plants. So we want people to get more protein from plants and less from the high biological value protein in animal products.
This is so interesting. Now, what I'm going to do is take a minute here to put that little note from the sponsors here, but I want to come back to another question. You have painted a fantastic foundation of thinking, ways that we have some of the major inflammatory and contributory problems of deterioration and I'm thinking maladaptive, malabsorption, malnutrition, the whole thing. You've done a great job of putting a foundation here. Let me go back and take this break. And when I come back, what I'm going to do is ask you to take the next step. There are two organs that I think are really closely related to each other, and that is the brain and the heart. And we're going to jump on those guys a little bit. We'll start with the heart, ask a little bit about the brain, because there's a debate right now about whether diets even help brain or don't help brain. Some people are saying, no, it's just exercise. So we'll come back in just a moment. We'll take a few minutes now to take a break. Well, folks, you know as well as I do that psychiatric treatment failure, especially after multiple medication trials and those very, very brief hospitalizations, may prove insufficient to deal at home with the complexity of troubled children and those adolescents from 6 to 17 years old. Improved care, those next mandatory steps, should include a more comprehensive approach to address those multiple levels of challenges, from family to peers to school, diagnostically from defiance to depression, on every level for families, including military families internationally. The Barry Robinson Center's 32-acre open college-like campus in Norfolk, Virginia, provides safety and security and clean, comfortable living. How do we know? We refer folks over there all the time, strongly endorse what they're doing. So for further information, an informed interview, connect at this page, barryrobinson.org/core. Well, you folks already know that here at Core Brain Journal, we're on a mission to introduce you to resources that make significant contributions to the investigation of those predictable mind science applications. Our colleagues at DHA Lab Group provide a real difference with treatment options for people at every level, from first awareness of mind problems to those frustrating times when even well-informed treatment becomes surprisingly unpredictable. For my entire professional life, from psychoanalysis to brain scans, I've searched for, yes, improved predictability. The good news for all of us, from professionals to patients, remarkably effective research offers useful, cost-effective, organic options far beyond guesswork with psychiatric medications alone. DHA Lab tests measure unbalanced biomedical details through easily available testing, now available globally for a variety of molecular answers from, for example, methylation, copper, and cryptopyrrole challenges. Check in for more details at dhalab.com core. That's dhalab.com/core. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fuhrman. This is amazing stuff and really interesting. It has so much. I think one of the things that we're very interested in, I know, is the application, the street application of the science. So let's take a minute to talk about heart disease. You have a whole book on it. I know you're not going to be able to hit it as thoroughly as you actually know it, but let's talk about heart disease, what's happened with diet and heart disease. And then we'll before we close, we want to talk about brain, longevity, brain, and cognitive deterioration, even with brain injury. What can we do about that? So let's hit heart disease, if you will, please.
Right. Well, the main point with heart disease is that it's a disease that never has to happen. It's not normal for our species. And there are populations around the world, even today, like the Catawba study off a little small island off the coast of New Guinea, where their inhabitants don't have heart disease or high blood pressure. And for generations, nobody ever had heart attacks. And primitive populations living in the jungles, we're saying didn't have heart disease like we see today. The point I'm making is heart disease is preventable and it's reversible. And I published a study in a October 2015 issue of the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine, showing that with more than 400 people, that the systolic blood pressure dropped on the average 26 points. That's more powerful than drugs. And cholesterol, and other studies showing a nutritarian diet dropped cholesterol more than statin drugs do, by more than a third. But the point I'm making here is when you lower your cholesterol with food and not drugs, and when you lower your blood pressure back to normal again with food and not drugs, you get much more protection because it's representing a biological repair process that's going on. You're repairing the endothelium. You're removing atherosclerotic plaque. You're restoring elasticity. You're preventing inflammation. You're reducing the risk of clot forming because clots form due to breakage, the mobility of the calcified cap over the soft cholesterol base. When you suck out the cholesterol out of the base, you stabilize the cap, and you have less chance of the cap cracking and exposing the inflammatory center of the underbelly of the endothelium. The point I'm making is that drugs can't do what food can do. Drugs cannot do this. They can't. You've got to get back. So we have to tell our population that when they're having high blood pressure, what we really should tell them is they have to start eating before they develop these problems. They should be eating right. But if they have these problems, they just can't go to the doctor and think taking a drug is going to protect them, because it's not. And you know what? People aren't even given informed consent because they're not told, for example, that studies show, give you an example, women taking calcium channel blockers for 10 years or more, a major study showed they had double the incidence of breast cancer from using calcium channel blockers. We're talking about many of these drugs. Statin medications have been shown in studies to dramatically increase the risk of invasive breast cancer as well. We're talking about giving people medications that have little effects and increase the risk of cancer, while at the same time, they lower diastolic blood pressure too low. To get the systolic blood pressure in a favorable range, you would have pushed the diastolic blood pressure into an unfavorable range, and the coronary arteries refill during diastole when the heart relaxes. And if the heart doesn't get back to if the blood doesn't return from the extremities to the heart fast enough during diastole, the heart's getting episodic ischemia, which can lead to cardiac arrhythmias, irregular heartbeat, and sudden cardiac death. So the medications, these blood pressure medications, lead to sudden cardiac death. They lead to cardiac arrhythmias. They have dangerous effects, and people using these drugs aren't given the option of using excellent nutrition as an alternative that's going to be much more effective and protective. So I'm very, very adamant that people utilize nutrition here and not just rely on drugs.
I mean, that is such a thorough, it's amazing that you could say all of that so explicitly and so quickly. I'm sure you've said it many times, but it's so graphic. I mean, yes, I'm a medical person, but from this point of view, from what you're speaking about, I'm really more or less a layperson. I've been interested in this for a long time, but in terms of where you are with it, and you put it out so nicely and so clearly, I mean, it's really very explicit and undeniable. I'm looking forward to reading your book in this regard, the heart disease book, because it's one of the things that we see is so acute. We see it happen all the time in our offices, and it's directly related to brain function. It seems to me that individuals who have the cardiac issues then subsequently or collaterally or whatever have the secondary brain issues as well. And we see so many people that just can't get well with throwing psych meds at them that have cognitive decline. I just interviewed, you'd be interested in this, Dr. Fuhrman, I just interviewed Dr. Andy Farah on Hemingway's brain. And we think about what was going on with Hemingway and how his brain deteriorated and his chronic traumatic encephalopathy, brain injuries, but he just kept going downhill. And we know that a lot of it had to do with his alcohol, his eating habits, and his, his entire situation. And he was cognitively gone and then went to the Mayo Clinic and had 20 shock treatments. So it was an interesting episode. But anyway, I'll get off of that, but it's apropos. So let's segue a little bit. You've done a great foundation with cardiovascular integrity. Then could you talk a little bit about this concept? And there's a debate going on in the Alzheimer deterioration dementia group that maybe diet isn't necessary. Maybe we should just think about everybody exercising more, and that's the real answer.
Well, sorry if I don't join that debate, because I just think that they haven't reviewed the literature then. Then they're poorly versed in the preponderance of evidence that's out there. It's never just exercise. It's always a combination of factors. We know, for example, you've heard of vascular dementia. We know that the brain shrinks when it doesn't get oxygen. When you have atherosclerosis of the brain, it shrinks. We know we call dementia brain diabetes because we know diabetics have higher amount of dementia and they get more depression and more prone to violence as well. So we know that sugar destroys the brain. We know that lack of nutrients destroys the brain. We know that omega-3 fatty acid deficiencies shrink brain tissue. We know there's a higher incidence of brain shrinkage in people with omega-3 index below 3 have much smaller brains as they age. So, in other words, we can't oversimplify the factor. Almost every disease is caused by multiple factors.
Yes.
It's multifactorial, right? Mm-hmm. And the more factors we uncover, and the more factors we address, and the more factors we repair, the more protection we're going to get. We can't just say it's just exercise. We know that people who exercise a lot still at high risk of heart disease if they don't eat right, and still could be high risk of cancer. Sure, exercise is protective to a degree, but it's probably only 10% contributor, and especially when we're talking here about brain function. We know that there are studies that show that 2 servings of commercial baked goods a week, we're talking about some cookies and some bagels twice a week, increase to double the risk of developing depression. We know that depression is related to diet, sun exposure, light exposure. People in dark climates have high risk of depression. Vitamin D deficiency, omega-3 deficiency, all these things, and fatty acid imbalances, and lack of phytochemicals and antioxidants in the brain all increase the risk of developing depression. And I've been treating depression for 25 years using nutrition and getting people well and saying, that the problem with these SSRIs is that your body becomes, more serotonin needy after the years of taking them, and it's very hard to get off them. The problem with them is your body becomes accommodative to them.
That's true.
You require them to you can't take them away after using them for so many years. You're higher risk of developing depression again. The point is that we to make sure to utilize nutrition, and I have a lot of friends who are psychiatrists today utilizing these nutritional principles in their practices, getting phenomenally improved results, not requiring, making people make more, how should I say, more sustained recovery so they don't become drug dependent, even if they require medications temporarily. You know what I mean? They don't become drug dependent for the rest of their life because they repair and they fix the contributory causes. And dementia, what you're bringing up, dementia and brain shrinkage, we know that a high sugar diet causes loss of intelligence even in children. we're seeing, we do studies, and we have studies that are children who are fed more fast food and more sugar in their diet when they're young, even are showing cognitive and behavioral difficulties by the time they're in elementary school. We're saying we're starting to see brain damage, loss of intelligence, behavioral problems, and starting of even mental disorders early in life. And even people with behavioral problems, even people in problem schools, when they're fed better, they do better. And there's even studies on prisoners who have a propensity towards violence and criminal behavior, who are fed better and now have less recidivism and less chance of going back to prison again. And I'm also saying one extra thing. I'm saying that sugar is a gateway drug to more heavy drug use, because sugar becomes our first it sets off dopamine stimulation of the brain, just like opiates do. And excessive dependency on using food for stimulation and alcohol for stimulation gets people addicted to stimulation. And they want to go, they seek more stimulants in life, and they're more prone and have a higher propensity for drug abuse later on in life. And when we're talking about people who eat more fast food and eat more junk food, be at higher rates of developing drug addiction, now look at who's in federal prisons. It's half the people in federal prisons are there for nonviolent, drug-related crimes, right? Drug-seeking behaviors. Yeah. It is what floods our federal prisons. And this is all goes back to food. Not that they didn't do enough running or soccer when they were kids. It's not lack of exercise. It's junk food that started this process.
You know, that is so terribly interesting. Now, I was compelled to interrupt you, but you were saying so many wonderful things there. I have this question that popped right in when you were talking about it, because one of the things we see so often, and you're an expert on this, I know you deal with this all day, every day, and that is, how do you get somebody over there? Do you have a program? Like, for example, what would be your favorite book of yours that would say, hey, guys, this you need to do to handle your psychological brain problems? Which of the books would you say would be the one that, of the several books that you've written, would be the one? And do you have a program on top of it that has a structure for actually beginning and practicing that process?
That's right. And, you know, whether people they can buy, you know, and they can go to my website and see the books I've written. And many of my books would serve that purpose, because they're, you know, for better brain function. But if they're getting older in life and they're high blood pressure and they're concerned about loss of memory and brain function, then they should get The End of Heart Disease. They should get that book, because it's the same issue. But if they're younger, they should get Superimmunity. Superimmunity, okay. If they're overweight, they should get The End of Dieting, because it talks about more emotional overeating and food addiction, and how to get rid of this diet mentality where you're jumping on and off diets and yo-yoing your weight up and down. Then The End of Dieting would be better. So I mentioned 3 books: Superimmunity, The End of Dieting, and The End of Heart Disease. And then one of my cookbooks to help you make it, you know, my books all have recipes in them, but I have cookbooks with contributors from world-class chefs that really make healthy taste great. Because what I'm saying here is, because I know what people are thinking as they're listening. They're saying, yeah, we know if you eat a lot of vegetables and mushrooms and onions and, you know, berries and seeds, if you eat healthy food, you're going to be healthier. That's probably logical, and I probably accept that. But I don't want to eat healthier. I want to enjoy my life, and I'm willing to take my chances just to enjoy my life more and eat whatever I feel like eating. But what I'm saying right now is that that's delusional. It's the irrational, food-addicted self-talking. That you don't enjoy your life more when you're eating unhealthy. You enjoy your life more when you take good care of your health, and you learn the recipes, and you get your taste buds strong, and healthy eating tastes just as good as unhealthy eating when you learn how to do it right.
Fantastic. Now listen, we only have a couple minutes left, Joel, and I want to bring up one other thing, and that is Dr. Fuhrman was talking to me offline before we started about a book that he is moving towards, which sounded very exciting. You could please, Joel, do a little plug for that book about the fast food genocide, which I thought was such a interesting and potentially comprehensive book as well, that you're thinking about having out in October 17.
Right. The book Fast Food Genocide is my first book in my life that I've ever written that's not a self-help book. It's a book to change the problems in society, more or less. Fast Food Genocide. You can learn the information there, of course, and benefit from it. And it's going to spur on I'm hoping, a tremendous change in society. But it discusses in the book Fast Food Genocide how when we bring donuts to our kids' soccer games, we trick kids to fast food restaurants, it destroys their genetic potential, it destroys their intelligence. Do you know, for example, that children who eat one serving of French fries a week, just one serving a week, have a 27% increased risk of breast cancer as an adult?
Oh my God.
One serving a week.
I did not know that. That is amazing.
It's amazing the damage that we're doing to our population. And the book talks a lot about bigotry and racism. Because we're talking here about the fact that in urban communities, with food deserts, not having access to fruits and vegetables and fresh food is destructive to people's health and their brains. And we're blaming populations, we're blaming them, and we're thinking there's genetic differences between the races. And I'm saying that these differences are the food availability. And that, I go through the history of when the slaves were freed in the early and the mid part of the 18th centuries after the Civil War, and how they intellectually and educationally were flourishing and doing wonderfully well. And then we talked about how with the white supremacy movement and with Jim Crow laws driving blacks from the South into northern cities, and then with World War I having fast foods and processed foods being developed so people can eat them on the battlefield and have foods not turn bad, and people were living on processed foods, and we started feeding inner cities processed foods, and fresh foods become more unavailable, and then these inner city populations started to develop lower, it affected their intelligence, it affected their health tremendously. We had higher rates of diabetes and all kinds of mental disorders. So the point I'm making is that there's a lot of food, there's a lot of, how should I say, economic, social, political, and historical aspects affecting crime, intelligence, productivity, and happiness in this country today. And we have to get to the basic cause. And food availability and food quality is at the base of so much of what ails us as a nation. And it's so much the answer to having a better, happier, and more, and a society that's less violent and more, and people, and less crime, and better relationships, and kindness, and less aggression. That food is such a plays an important role, and it has to start with us as a society trying to improve the health of our fellow Americans.
What a terrific, comprehensive, global close, Joel. That's fantastic. I mean, now before we go, we do have to wind up. I'm looking at the time here. This was an engaging, fantastic conversation. I just loved listening to you. And the issue is I'm an innocent with your books. I can tell you that. But I think that I've got to start with the three that you mentioned right off. And I'm looking forward to your next one as well. It comes out in October on the fast food genocide. So please give us a website to go to, and we'll get people over there, and we'll look forward to. And you have I think you might be able to provide a PDF for a download as well. He was talking about that a little bit. I'm not going to promise anything because we haven't closed on that point. But tell us where we can go to connect with you, Joel.
Well, drfuhrman.com, my website, has lots more information, and of course, the recipes and success stories, of course. But it's drfuhrman.com is drfuhrman.com.
It's going to be in the show notes, folks. Thank you so much, Dr. Fuhrman. We really appreciate it. I mean, a leading authority. It's a real privilege to have you on and to share your information with our audience. I just really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Best of health to you and all your listeners.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.